Welcome, everyone. Today we are going to cover some of the latest changes in the ISO 9001 Quality Management System Standard. Next slide. I'm your host, Michael Allegro from SarahTech. Today we are fortunate to have some outstanding guest speakers from our partner Siemens. They're part of their quality management team, Christopher Piella and Mary McAtee. Before Chris gets started with their introduction, I'd like to take a couple of minutes and tell you about SarahTech. Next slide. For over 15 years, SarahTech has been helping companies solve their product development business challenges by helping them rationalize and optimize their processes around their design, analysis, manufacturing, and quality systems. We are an industry leader in the PLM space through our partnership with Siemens, and we are their #1 partner in the Americas. Our headquarters are in Orange County, California, but our team of professionals are spread out across the country so that it puts us closer to our customers so that we can better serve them. Next slide. We have a lot of material to cover today, but I did want to point out that you can ask questions through the GoToWebinar control panel. And we'll try to answer those questions either right away or at the end of the webinar, whenever it makes sense. Also, at the end of the webinar, there will be an opportunity for you to take a survey. We really would appreciate your feedback on that, and hope you take a couple of minutes to fill out that survey. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand the reins over to Chris, and take it away, Chris.
Thank you very much. So as mentioned before, my name is Christopher Piella. I bring a 20-plus year background in reliability and compliance engineering to Siemens and to the organization. So I'll be presenting today with my co-host, Mary McAtee. Mary, again, brings a lifetime of experience to the topic of quality engineering and compliance. She has led her career has taken her across multiple high-tech and highly regulated industries, including infrared detector development with the New England Research Center. She worked with MACOM and Space Center for reliability and microelectronics, and she's also a lead assessor in a series of ISO standards and IATF standards and OSHA. So we'll be leading the conversation, and as mentioned earlier, if you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box. We'll be happy to answer them, again, either in real time or at the end of the presentation. So as we begin, we're going to talk today about the changes to the recent changes to ISO 9000 and how those changes have trickled down into other standards and compliance standards. So as we all know, ISO 9001 forms the backbone on which all of the other ISO standards are based. So ISO 14001 for environmental management systems, ISO 13485 for quality management systems for medical devices, and IATF 16949 quality systems for automotive manufacturers. They're all formed on that backbone of ISO 9001. And ISO 9001 tends to be updated approximately every 7 years, and the other standards follow suit. And we are at the point of one of those changes today.
So one of the things that's important, I believe, in the changes that have been made, we're going to talk a bit more in the next slide about IATF 16949, but that has moved from a TS 16949 technical specification to now being tagged with IATF, the Automotive Task Force that owns that standard. And historically, it doesn't play well with the other standards. It's kind of a red-headed stepchild. It's always a bit different, and it's becoming more in line, so I was very happy to see that when that was released this year.
So ISO 9001 2015, as the name implies, it was released in 2015. It replaces the previous standard of ISO 9001 2008 for all new registrations. And existing registered companies, and this is critical, right, have until 2018 to update their compliance and surveillance assessments to the 2015 requirements.
And this is important, even if you're have an automotive registration. If you were registered to TS 16949, you have to have a separate and independent registration to ISO 9001. So don't lose sight of the fact that your alignment with the new standard has to keep pace with that.
And as Mary mentioned earlier, the other standards have also been updated and released, and they're all release status now. So ISO 14001, 2015, ISO 13485, 2015, and IATF 16949, 2015.
Now, the important thing here is there's a couple others coming out at the end of the year, and 18001 probably the most critical of those. That's the health and safety standard. That'll be updated and should be released around the first of the year. I'm not seeing a lot of early release information around that, but we always care about that because that's where you're doing your hazards analysis and control, so that usually has a big impact on businesses.
So how significant are the changes? The changes are primarily philosophical versus mechanical. They're intended to better address companies that are primarily service-based, adjustments that better support companies that are registered to more than one standard, and there's a shift, and this is again a critically important shift, from a risk versus opportunity approach.
So that's probably, we're going to talk a lot more about that later. And this is the thing that have a lot of companies really a little nervous right now. How am I going to approach this? So what we're going to try and do with this is take a very pragmatic look at what you should really be concerned about and what you should simply understand.
So the renumbering and renaming of clauses, as a part of the realignment to better support service companies and those with multiple registrations, clauses have been renumbered and renamed. So each of the updated standards contains a matrix aligning the old and the new. And the language is clear that these updates need not be reflected in the existing quality management system documentation and records, but should be reflected in new ones created for future compliance.
So this is very important. So they do not expect you to go back through all your documents and all of your records and update clause references. If you can create one document that shows that cross-reference, and you can actually just crib the one that comes with your standard and keep that under control so that you've got that to show to the auditor, that's acceptable. And this nomenclature change is really important because you used to have different language for corrective action and non-conforming material and training depending on the standard that you're looking at. Now they flattened that language, made it similar so that it all reflects the same thing and is more relevant to a service versus a manufacturing organization.
So there's a new structure, and it's a 10-step structure going from scope to normative references, terms and definitions, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and then improvement. And
the leadership change that's up there, we're going to talk more about that later, but that's an important change. They're really trying to shift that responsibility up and away from the boots on the ground folks to really force management to take an active role.
So the continuity of nomenclature and vocabulary. All the terms and nomenclature for a given clause have been rewritten to permit continuity of language and make it easier for the future change process across all the core ISO standards. For example, the clauses for nonconformities and corrective actions will be precisely the same across all the core standards. The same will be true for all the other core clause content. And this will make maintaining compliance to multiple standards within a single company a much simpler process.
You know, I used to visit companies that had a 14,000 registration, a 9,001 registration. I go in and talk to those folks. They'd have 2 or 3 different audit groups that were auditing on a regular basis, not sharing checklists, not sharing questions. It was 3 separate exercises, 3 different management review activities, and that's a big time suck and waste of money. if you can combine those things, and that's what they're trying to help you do here.
There's also changes in responsibility. There's no longer a requirement for a person to be identified as the management representative. Responsibility has always resided with senior management of any organization. And the need for a liaison between senior management and the responsibility for the quality management system remains unchanged. This responsibility can now be addressed by a committee if it makes better sense, business sense.
The important thing for you to remember here is you still can't pass it off to a consultant. So in other words, you can't hire quality is us by Joe from down the street and say, he's the person that runs my quality management system. That's still unacceptable. They expect your senior management to own the QMS system.
And there's also documentation requirements changes. The standard now indicates that documentation needs to be sufficient to accurately operate the business processes. Some companies will mistakenly think that this update means that documentation is no longer necessary. This would be a very serious mistake. Quality system manuals are no longer required. Procedures, work instructions, and form control documents, as well as specifications and other controlled documents, need to be present and accessible with sufficient content to support accurate understanding of the business, quality management systems, and the processes.
So when the auditor comes in, if you've got a good auditor, most of them are pretty good, some aren't, they're going to be smart enough to look at your corrective action system, your customer complaints, and talk to a number of people doing the same job. And if they can see a pattern of people not doing the same thing in a repeatable fashion and outcomes that are causing problems with the product or with the customers ultimately, or you're chasing the same corrective action issues over and over because documentation is inadequate and training is inadequate, they're going to be all over you about not having sufficient documentation. So if you're going to reduce your documentation because you can now, be judicious about how you do it and make sure you have enough to run your business.
So control of documentation and records. Nothing has changed for how controlled documentation must be managed. Key points remain unchanged. Identification of documents by title and control numbers, revision and revision control, release approvals, change management controls, having some form of ongoing assessment for continued suitability and accuracy, retention requirements, and provisions for securing uncontrolled documentation from unintended use.
Now, word that's filtering back to me from some of the early audits that have been done from our customers and from our registrar is there's an increased emphasis on retention, data retention process. They're really looking to see that you're hanging on to records that you should be hanging on to, that your retention times are prudent, and that you're assessing things for currency if they're active documents that you're using. We're seeing that they're putting increased scrutiny around that.
So we have an example here of a document control where we have an approved and released document. This is for a sewing circles, regular single needle, just a screen capture to show that we have a release schedule, an expiration schedule, an audit schedule, a release date. So these are all, this is an example of how that type of requirement could be met using a Siemens QMS solution. Again, we've got the revision control and the approval history associated with that document here, all time and date stamped.
And that's important. I think they're going to be looking for when did something come into effect, when was the last time it was changed, and how relevant is it to what's going on. So, sorry, Chris.
No, it's fine. In continuing that thread around records and data retention, the language describing the records has changed slightly, but not the requirements for data and record retention. You must have a method for management of records, and your records must be retained in compliance with your data retention policy, plus all related regulatory requirements, such as from the FDA or FAA or anyone else. So we have, again, a screen capture, an example where we have a corrective and preventative action document where we have a superseded date and we have a record retention date. So we know when that document was superseded and how long we're going to retain it. So increased emphasis areas. There are some areas where there is an increased focus and emphasis, but no specific changes of the mechanics. So your quality policy, it needs to be relevant and relatable to the quality objectives, as well as being properly communicated and understood within the organization. The quality objectives must be relevant to the quality policy. It must be defined and owned. It must be resourced adequately for the objective. There must be a planned completion date. There must be tracking of progress towards the objective, and they must be adequately communicated.
So for everybody on the call right now, if I were to come into your organization, do these things all align? Because there's going to be increased emphasis on this. A lot of people's quality policy is simply a slogan. We're the best at what we do, or something like that. It needs to be relevant to your business objectives, and your quality objectives need to have an owner, and they need to be tracked for progress. So many organizations I go into, they state quality objectives, but you can't tell where they're at in the process. You can't tell if they've been accomplished, and you can't tell who's responsible for making sure that they happen. So pay some attention to that as you're getting ready for your next assessment.
So there's an increased emphasis on process control, process inputs and outputs, resources, qualifications and competencies, process verification and validation, and ongoing key performance indicators specific to the process.
This is going to become even more important because you're no longer required to have a quality manual, but you're still required to show how all of your different quality and business processes work together to form a system. So that piece is still there. So how are you going to show that if you don't have a quality manual? So one of the things that people are doing is putting a little meat in process control documents. So it's really showing the inputs and the outputs and showing how these processes work together and relate to each other.
So there's some areas that are easily misunderstood. First of all, the needs of interested parties. Because these can include customers, suppliers, and in case of environmental health and safety, it could actually include your community and regulatory agencies. There's resources clause have increased emphasis on adequacy and competency. The specific clauses for customer requirements and supplied materials has been diffused throughout other clauses, but the basic requirements remain unchanged in principle. And so the supplier has been replaced with language referring to externally provided products and services, but the intent and base requirements remain the same.
And the only thing I'm going to say on this slide is nothing's really changed about how you have to manage your suppliers. And in terms of training and competency, one of the things they're going to be looking for, there's no explicit language to say this, but they want some means for you to say that training was effective. Not just show them a record and say this person got trained on this date. How did you assure that they understood what they were trained on and that they retained that? So one of the ways you can do that is by having an effectiveness review where the manager or some other party circles back 30 days or so after the training was delivered to see if it's effective, see if there's any issues with that person doing that task, maybe auditing them, but there needs to be some sort of means testing for effectiveness.
There's an increased emphasis on upstream and downstream understanding for each employee defined as awareness of their impact on quality of products and services, their fellow employees, customers, and interested parties. Language has been updated throughout the standard to make continued reference to products and services.
Now, one of the reasons this is important is they really want someone, if they're auditing them, to be able to say, where did this come from before you, and what's your responsibility for where it's going next? And I want people to be able to answer that. And that sounds simple, but there's so many organizations I go in and audit where they can't answer that question. An employee can't really say where it's going after it leaves them, and in many cases they can't identify where it came from, and they can't answer the question, what happens if I don't do the specific thing that I'm doing right now correctly? What's the likely impact?
So, where did preventative action go? Because there's no longer a clause specific to preventative action. The requirement has not gone away. It's even more important. There's risk versus opportunity decision making, and the clause specific to continual improvement will drive preventative actions even more than the previous dedicated clause will. There is no mandate to stop doing preventative actions if you find them a useful tool.
So I say ignore them at your peril. You know, if you look at what the standard says, they expect you to be measuring risk and mitigating risk, and we're going to be talking more about that in a minute, and that is going to drive continuous improvement properly done. So that's where your preventive action is actually going.
So now we're talking about risk versus opportunity decision making. And this is the most significant shift in philosophy for the standards. Risk must be quantified and considered for all key processes and decisions. Important elements to understand about how the standard expects risks to be addressed include there's no requirement to eliminate all risk. There is a requirement to identify and manage risk. There's no single prescribed formula for how a business is expected to address this requirement. And this is one of the areas where auditors will likely be learning, and a learning mindset initially that will mature between now and 2018.
So you want to think about that and pay attention to it. When the auditors come in, they're likely going to be looking to you to say, how are you doing this in your organization? And they may have a preference for you to do it in a particular way, but you don't necessarily have to do it the way they're saying, because there's no defined way that says this is how you're going to measure risk. And we're going to talk more about some examples of how to do it, but don't let them bully you into a particular method. Do the right thing for your business and your people and what you can absorb. And you can start small and expand over time. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Get more serious about it over time.
So again, that's what you just said, Mary. Is that confidence in your approach will be key in assuring your registrar and other third-party auditors that you both understand and have prudently addressed the requirement.
Yep.
So getting into identifying risk, every process and key decision potentially impacting a product and its service quality is a candidate for assessing risk. Examples of some areas where risk is both present and should be considered include processes, new product development, undertaking a new business or formally a customer or a customer requirements or contract reviews, addressing nonconformances and corrective actions, internal and external provider audit results, environmental health and safety risks, and other processes that could pose a risk to your specific business.
You know, if you sat down and look at how you run your business, you know, the old section called contract review is all diffused now throughout these requirements. So you still have to assess challenges of new business that you're taking on, what's going to happen if you don't address a particular element in a corrective action that you've identified as a root cause that costs $100,000 to address. How do you indicate that you're making a conscious decision not to do that? So these are all important things that you need to be able to answer when that auditor comes in, because this is what they're going to be looking at.
So there's methods for quantifying risk. And the two common approaches for quantifying risk. The standard does not specify a method, and both are equally accessible. There's empirically calculating the risk, making use of specific numerical formulas to quantify risk. And one example of this is the risk priority number, or RPN calculation. In this calculation, it's the product of a detection, occurrence, and severity to arrive at a numerical assessment of the risk. Or you can have a subjective calculation of risk that can rely on a simpler methodology, or maybe a rating scale for risk as simple as serious, moderate, low, or no identified risk impact.
So I've got some people that are freaking out over this and saying, wow, I have to do a FEMA now, a failure modes effects analysis for everything that I'm doing. How am I going to support that? Where are the resources for me to do this? That's not what they're asking you to do. In the automotive industry, there are other mandates that require you to do that, but in general, simply to comply with the ISO standard, they're not asking for a FEMA or anything that complex. They're asking you to do some sort of baseline to say, this is the risks that I see with this. How am I going to offset this risk? And by offsetting that risk, have I done it effectively, and has it improved my situation and moderated the impact that that risk might have?
So here's an example of the failure modes and effects analysis with the RPN value, and it's, this calculation can be initially matched with a numerical value or simply used to lump risks into categories. We have some other screen captures here of a more simpler approach where we have a simple subjective rating scale where, what's the likelihood of this risk to occur, how often could it occur, would this risk affect multiple locations? Can this risk be avoided or averted? So there's some examples. But what the standard states about managing risk versus opportunity as it relates to the process. Can the process achieve its intended results? Can it enhance desirable effects? Can the process prevent or reduce undesirable effects? Can we achieve our improvements? We evaluate the effectiveness of actions to address and manage risks, and actions taken should be commensurate with the potential impact on the product and the service.
So if you've got a risk that's extremely minor, if it occurs, the impact is negligible, such as possibly returning a call in a timely manner or something along that line, versus a risk where if you were off the mark on that risk and it's not addressed properly, it could cause physical injury, it could cause a major product recall with your customer base. So it expects you to be prudent and consider the impact of risk when you're addressing it, and they're not all equal, and how you choose to address them should not be equal.
So there's acceptable methods to manage risk, and the following methods are listed in the standard as ways to address risk. There's avoiding risk, there's taking risk to pursue an opportunity, there's eliminating the risk source, there's changing the likelihood or consequences, you can share the risk, and you can retain the risk by informed decision. The standard speaks at length on the positive elements of assuming risk, such as new markets and alliances or adopting a new technology or other scenarios.
And that piece loops back to the sharing risk portion. You've got customers that encourage you to penetrate new markets and may even want to partner with you in those ventures. You've got suppliers who say, we're willing to attempt to produce this new component with you, and we'll share some of the risk and development activities around that. That's what we mean by sharing risk. And people don't identify that as part of how they're managing risk, the fact that they're sharing it with a customer or they're sharing it with a supplier. Don't forget those options as you're doing it.
So to summarize this, pick a methodology and document and train appropriate resources on the process. Start simply and evolve based upon the data. Use what you discover to improve and safeguard your business. Make sure your risk management process is part of your internal audit program and management review process. Use the data to apply resources and efforts proportional to the risk. Measure and monitor your results and adjust over time. And don't overreach and undermine your potential for success.
So don't bite off more than you can chew would be one of the things that I would say in summary for that. And the other piece is there's no mandate to have it be part of management review, but I think it's prudent that it become one of the elements that you look at during your management review process, because I believe the standard is going to put out a point release to require that, and that's some of the things I'm hearing from the industry right now. So why not be ahead of the curve and start taking this and turning it into actionable information?
So we've got some examples here, again, of risk analysis with different types of charts and graphs that we support, things like Ishikawa diagrams. So these are just some various examples of risk analysis. So there's, excuse me, there's other sources of assistance. Contact your registrar and see if they're offering any classes or documentation to standards.
Or you can give your co-presenter CPR because it obviously joked.
I just swallowed the wrong way. I apologize. Contact technical in professional organizations, or consider using a compliance management system such as the Siemens product to provide a framework to transition into the most value of the new requirement.
Well said, Chris.
Okay, well, I think that's the end of the presentation. Now I'm choking up as well. Pardon me. So I do see that we do have a couple of questions. Mary, are you ready to answer a couple of questions?
I am.
All right, so let's see. The first question is, if I want to keep maintaining my quality manual, will that be a problem?
No, they're not requiring you to stop doing anything. So you still own your business and how you want to manage your business. And one of the things we talked about is you still have to show the interaction of processes and the outputs from one end to another. So if you are going to do away with your quality manual, you need to think about where you're going to document that, whether it's process control documents. And most people have used their quality manual historically to demonstrate that piece. So if it works for you and it's something that you use and provide to potential customers as verification that you have a quality management system, there's no requirement that says you have to stop doing that.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Another one is, do I need to go back and align all my historical documentation and records to the new elements of the 2015 standard?
Nope. All you have to do is, if you're smart, you'll create a matrix or take the matrix that's actually provided in the annex of the standard and put that under control in your control document system and indicate that over time you're going to begin to align with those elements as those documents come up for review. And that's an important piece to say. When you're transitioning from one standard, the old version of the standard, to the new one, create a quality plan so that you can show what you need to do. You've thought about it. You've got all your thoughts organized. And you've got something to show the auditor when they come in to say, this was our plan for transitioning to the new standard. These are all the things we've changed. These are all the new things that we're doing, so that you're essentially pushing them into your framework rather than reacting to theirs.
Okay. Another question, what does it mean when the standard says that quality objectives must have an owner and milestones documented?
A lot of companies that I go into right now, I see a quality objective that says things like, we're going to reduce customer complaints by 20%. And I'll say, okay, who's the person that owns this objective and is running the team that's going to make that happen? And they're like, well, no, we decided we want to do this, and this is our objective, and we've published the objective. Well, who owns it? Where's your milestones for how you're going to get there? What are the steps you're going to take? Show me the progress you've made. And it can't do that. So what the standard has done is gotten much firmer in its language, so it's going to be looking for an owner, whether it's a group or an individual. It's going to look for milestones, and it's going to look for a conclusion date, even if that date keeps moving because it takes longer than you anticipated to make it happen.
Okay, great. And then it looks like we have one more question. Is risk now one of the mandatory elements that must be part of the management review?
It is not required to be part of management review, but I think you'd be foolish not to add it. You still have to look at assessments. You've got to look at corrective action. You've got to look at the 6 that were always there. Make this a 7th one. Start pulling it, risk assessment in there, and also that gets it in front of your management team so that they understand the areas of risk. I mean, a lot of times they're not necessarily plugged into what's been identified as significant risk in the organization, and the management review activities an opportunity to get very high-level risk in front of your management team.
That's good input. Well, that looks like the last of the questions. I do want to say thank you very much again to Christopher and Mary. I think that was an excellent presentation.
Yep.
Yeah,
yep.
Excellent. So this is going to end the webinar. If you could please fill out the survey at the end, we'd really appreciate it. And thank you again for attending.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.